A streak of light cuts across the Roman sky. It is the year 44 before Christ. Julius Caesar is dead, cut down by men who claimed they were saving the Republic from a ruler who had risen too high. In the months after his assassination, public games are held in his honor, games celebrating his victories, his power, and his place in Roman memory. Then something appears above the crowds, a comet, bright enough to be seen with the naked eye, hanging in the heavens for 7 days. Romans begin to whisper. Augustus, the Caesar's adopted heir, seizes the moment. The comet, he says, is no ordinary sign. It proves that Julius has been taken up among the gods, not fully equal to them perhaps, but welcomed into their company, elevated beyond ordinary death. And with that claim, a door opens into one of the strangest and most important worlds in ancient history, the world of Roman pagan life and worship. That world matters far more than people often realize. Christianity did not appear in a vacuum. Christ was executed by Roman authority. The apostles preached across Roman cities, Roman roads, and Roman provinces. The early church grew, suffered, and spread in a civilization saturated with Roman religious habits. So if we want to understand the first centuries of Christianity, we need to understand the world that surrounded it, not just its politics, not just its armies, but its daily rituals, its sacrifices, its household shrines, its festivals, its temples, and above all, its assumptions about what religion was supposed to do. And one of the first things we need to say is that Roman paganism was not faith in the way Christians would later use that word. Romans themselves would not have described their religion primarily as faith, inner trust, or heartfelt belief. Roman religion was cultic, it was ritual, it was obligation. It was sacrifice performed in the proper order, so that one might receive practical benefit from the gods. A Roman did not need to feel emotionally transformed by a ritual for the ritual to matter. What mattered was doing it correctly. That distinction is absolutely essential. When modern people hear the word worship, they often think of inward devotion, prayer, reverence, songs, and the state of the heart. Roman pagan worship was not usually driven by that sort of interior emphasis. It was not about spiritual intimacy with a deity. It was about duty, precision, and benefit. If a rite required wine, you offered wine. If it required grain, you offered grain. If a festival demanded a procession, the procession had to take place as tradition required. You did not improvise. You did not casually substitute one offering for another. You did not ask too many questions about why the custom began long ago. Your task was to fulfill the obligation handed down from the past. And that already tells us something about the Roman mind. Roman religion was conservative in a very deep sense. It respected antiquity. It trusted inherited custom. It believed that the old ways had power because they were old. If a ritual had been performed for generations, then one did not tamper with it lightly. The past had authority simply because it was the past. Now, once we say that, we also have to say something else just as important. Roman paganism was not uniform. It was incredibly diverse. The Roman world stretched from Britain across Gaul and Spain, through Italy, across the Balkans, through Asia Minor, into Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. A world that large could never have practiced one single, perfectly identical form of pagan life. Local gods differed. Festivals differed. Customs differed. City traditions differed. Rural practices differed. A shrine in one region might mean very little in another. So whenever we talk about Roman pagan life in general, we are always painting with broad strokes. Still, broad patterns do exist. And the best place to begin is not with the temple, not with the emperor, and not even with the public festival. It is with the home. For the average Roman man or woman, pagan life began at the household level. The home was not religious only in rare moments. It was saturated with ritual memory. One of the most important elements in domestic religious life was the veneration of ancestors. Romans often referred to the ancestors as the maiores, the greater ones, those who had gone before. A family line was not simply a biological chain. It was a moral inheritance, a social identity, and in many ways, a sacred continuity. This was often patriarchal in structure. A family might look back to a founding male figure, a grandfather, great-grandfather, or some earlier ancestor understood as the origin or stabilizer of the household line. The dead were not worshipped as gods in the full sense, but they were honored, remembered, and treated with reverence. Families might visit burial sites on important dates, perhaps on the anniversary of a death or during set festival times. Oaths could be spoken there. Stories could be retold there. The dead remained part of the living memory of the family. That matters because Roman religion was always tied to continuity. To honor the ancestors was not merely to look backward sentimentally. It was to keep the family line intact. It was to say that your house, your name, your obligations, and your future children all belong to a chain stretching across generations. The ritual life of the home reinforced this idea constantly. Within the household itself, there would often be shrines to lesser deities associated with family protection, daily life, and domestic well-being. These were not usually the great gods in their most grand public form. You would not normally imagine an average family having some monumental domestic cult centered on Jupiter, as though the home were a miniature state temple. Household religion was often more intimate and more practical. Certain deities were associated with the hearth, with roads, with thresholds, with storage, with food, with fertility, and with the general protection of the family. The hearth especially mattered. The hearth was where warmth came from, where food was prepared, where family life gathered at the end of the day. In a world without modern comforts, the hearth was not decorative. It was central to life itself. So it is not surprising that lesser deities, local powers, and domestic rituals clustered around that focal point. And again, the important thing was not emotional sincerity in the modern sense. A Roman could perform these obligations without some burning inner passion. The key was correctness. Religion functioned like duty. The offerings had to be appropriate. The gestures had to follow tradition. The household cult was not there to give you inward peace as much as to secure practical blessing. That blessing, in Roman imagination, was usually material. Fertility, healthy children, business success, protection in travel, favor in military life, continuity of the family line, prosperity that could be passed on. Roman religion was deeply practical. The goal was not mystical union with the divine. It was the maintenance and strengthening of ordinary life. From the home, we move outward to the city. If domestic religion was intimate and ancestral, city religion was public, structured, and tied to social hierarchy. Roman cities were not democratic in the modern sense. They were governed and shaped by elites, men of wealth, rank, and public influence. Senatorial classes, equestrian classes, and local civic elites played enormous roles in maintaining and sponsoring the public religious life of the city. This is one reason Roman paganism cannot be separated from social class. Public religion required money. Temples had to be maintained, festivals had to be funded, processions had to be organized, sacrifices had to be provided, games had to be staged, coins or gifts might be distributed. None of that happened by accident. It happened because elites paid for it, oversaw it, and used it as part of their public identity. Now, we need to correct another common modern misunderstanding. A Roman temple was not the pagan equivalent of a church. It was not usually a place where a gathered congregation met weekly for teaching and fellowship in the way Christians later would. A temple was above all the house of the god. It marked the space of divine presence. It was holy ground, separated from ordinary civic space. So when Romans approached a temple, they were approaching the dwelling place of the deity associated with that site. In Ephesus, for example, the Temple of Artemis was not just a public building, it was the symbolic home of Artemis in that city. The architecture reinforced this separation. Columns, stairs, boundaries, and sacred precincts marked the difference between the common world and the god's space. Sacrifices at temples could be performed by priests in some settings, but often the central civic actors were the elites themselves, supported by ritual specialists who knew the correct cultic procedures. This again shows us that public worship was not merely private devotion magnified, it was civic performance. It was the city doing what was due to the gods. Throughout the year, cities also held festivals for particular gods. These festivals were major events. They were not marginal or optional entertainments. They were part of the rhythm of urban life. Different deities had different times, different forms of celebration, and different requirements. One festival might involve public sacrifice. Another might involve games. Another might involve a procession of a divine image through the streets. And one of the most important features of these festivals was economic generosity from above. Elites who funded festivals often distributed gifts, food, or money to the people. Special coins might be struck. Public generosity increased the popularity of the event and reinforced the prestige of those sponsoring it. For the lower ranks of society, festivals were not only religious moments, they were moments of tangible material benefit. That matters because religion, society, and politics were woven together tightly. A festival honored the gods, but it also honored the city. It reinforced hierarchy. It created goodwill. It displayed elite generosity. It reminded everyone that public order, prosperity, and divine favor belonged together. Processions were another major feature of public worship. In these ceremonies, an image of the god might be carried through the streets, following prescribed routes and stopping at important locations. Sometimes such a procession would end at a theater or amphitheater, where further rituals or public performances took place. These events were visual, communal, and highly symbolic. The deity was not hidden away. The deity moved through the life of the city, marking the streets as sacred space for a time. And yet, despite the spectacle, the Roman ideal in worship was not wild emotional frenzy. In fact, Romans often distrusted excessive emotionalism in religion. To become too ecstatic, too uncontrollable, too overwhelmed could look suspiciously like superstition. The Latin idea of superstitio was not simply generic religious fervor. It often meant a disordered or excessive relationship to the divine, especially an attempt to manipulate the gods through irrational intensity. This is a crucial difference between Roman paganism and many later religious forms. The Roman ideal was restraint. To lose control was embarrassing or suspect. To enter a trance, to behave wildly, or to appear seized by religious passion looked dangerous unless such behavior belonged to a very specific cultic role. The Roman admired composure, proper sequence, and ritual dignity. This is one reason Christianity would later appear so odd. Christians cared deeply about the heart. They spoke of loving God. They prayed with personal intensity. They sang. They spoke of faith and conviction. Roman religion did not depend on that sort of inner fire. It depended on outward correctness and inherited obligation. But all of this, home worship and city worship alike, stood within an even larger framework. And that framework was the imperial cult. Without emperor worship, the Roman world might have remained only a patchwork of local cults and regional religions tied loosely together by military power. But the imperial cult gave Roman pagan life a center. It did not erase local gods, it did not replace every deity with the emperor, but it gave the entire system a unifying political and sacred focus. We should be careful here, because myths abound. Roman emperors were not usually thought to be gods in exactly the same way the old Olympian deities were gods. The imperial cult worked through a more subtle idea. The emperor was associated with divine favor, divine election, divine wisdom, divine genius, a kind of special empowering presence granted by the gods. He was not simply an ordinary man, and he was certainly not just another politician. He stood in uniquely charged relation to heaven. Part of this idea was inherited from the East. The Greek world had already absorbed forms of ruler veneration through contact with Persian and Egyptian ideas of kingship, especially after Alexander the Great moved eastward and adopted more exalted forms of royal symbolism. Rome inherited and adapted these traditions. Augustus played a decisive role in shaping the imperial cult. After the death of Julius Caesar and the appearance of the famous comet, Augustus promoted the idea that Caesar had been exalted among the gods. This did not mean every Roman was now expected to think about divinity with philosophical precision. What mattered was public recognition that Rome's ruler stood under divine favor and in some sense participated in the sacred order of the empire. Here, two important ideas help explain Roman religion more broadly: syncretism and henotheism. Syncretism is the blending of religious traditions. When Rome conquered new territories, it often absorbed local gods, customs, and rituals into its own system. To modernize, this can look like cynical cultural compromise. But for Romans, it was often more than political convenience. It made sense within their view of the divine world. Henotheism helps explain why. In a henotheistic framework, one may believe in many gods while giving stronger allegiance to a principal god, and one may also assume that gods can appear under different names in different places. A Roman could therefore encounter a local deity in a newly conquered region and assume that this deity was somehow connected to one already known in Roman religion. Zeus and Jupiter, for example, could be treated as equivalent forms. Local gods might be seen as regional faces of larger divine realities. This was not mere tolerance. And this is extremely important. Rome did not absorb gods because it wanted to flatter conquered peoples. Rome absorbed gods because Rome wanted to conquer them too. If a region had its own divine powers, Rome preferred to pull those powers into the Roman system and place them under Roman dominance. This was spiritual subjugation as much as cultural flexibility. The gods of the empire were expected to support the empire, and nowhere was this more intense than in the army. The Roman military was one of the strongest centers of pagan devotion. Soldiers and generals believed deeply that success in battle depended on divine favor. Sacrifices mattered, omens mattered, proper ritual mattered. The Roman army did not think of religion as decorative. Religion was one of the conditions of victory. That helps explain something very important for later church history. The worst persecutions of Christians did not come immediately in the first generation. Some of the most severe persecutions came later, especially in the 3rd century and the early 4th century, just before Constantine. Why? In large part because military emperors, men drawn from the ranks of the army, believed that Rome's survival required restored ritual order. If the empire was in crisis, then perhaps the gods had been dishonored. If the gods had been dishonored, then public sacrifice had to be enforced. And if Christians refused, they could be seen not simply as odd religious dissenters, but as threats to the empire's very stability. At the center of this stood the genius of the emperor. This phrase referred to the emperor's divinely granted force, insight, and protecting spirit. To honor the emperor's genius was to honor the sacred dimension of Roman rule. And although imperial policy could encourage this from above, much of its strength came from below. Local elites often wanted to sponsor and intensify imperial cult worship because doing so could bring them prestige and favor from the center of power. In other words, emperor worship was not simply an imperial command imposed uniformly on a passive population. It was also a local strategy. City elites wrote letters, requested privileges, organized cultic honors, and tried to position themselves as loyal promoters of Roman identity. Their enthusiasm for the imperial cult could open doors for political advancement. So, once again, religion, ambition, and public order were inseparable. This brings us to Judaism and Christianity, because Rome did not react to both in the same way. When Romans encountered Judaism, they found it strange. Jews were strict monotheists. They refused to identify Yahweh with any Roman deity. They would not place him within the Roman pantheon. They would not sacrifice to the gods. This made Romans uneasy. But Judaism had one enormous advantage in Roman eyes. It was ancient. And Romans respected ancient religion. Antiquity carried weight in the Roman imagination. A religion that had existed for centuries, that could trace its customs far back into the past, had dignity simply because it was old. So although Romans found Jewish practice peculiar, they often allowed a degree of space for it. Jews might be permitted to worship their God in their own way, so long as they prayed for the emperor rather than sacrificing to him. The relationship was always tense, and it would worsen dramatically, especially by the time of the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. But there was at least a category for Judaism within Roman thought. It was ancient, strange, but old enough to be respected. Christianity was different. Romans did not see Christianity as the fulfillment of Judaism. They saw it as something new, and new religion was dangerous. If antiquity gave a cult credibility, novelty made it suspect. Christians had no respectable age in Roman eyes. They refused the gods. They rejected sacrifice. They would not honor the emperor's genius with cultic offerings. And, unlike the Jews, they did not enjoy the same kind of recognized ancestral legitimacy. That is why Christians were often called atheists. Not because they denied all spiritual reality, but because they denied the gods recognized by Roman society. They appeared godless in public terms. They did not join in the sacrificial system that held civic life together. They refused to do what Romans regarded as simple religious duty. And here, the Roman incomprehension becomes almost total. From the Roman point of view, why were Christians so stubborn? Why not simply offer a pinch of incense? Why not join the ritual outwardly and keep your private beliefs to yourself? Since Roman religion was not fundamentally about inward conviction, the Christian insistence on refusal looked absurd. If sacrifice is public duty, why die over it? Why suffer for it? Why let your family be ruined over what seems to Romanize a minor civic obligation? This is where the two worlds collide most sharply. Roman pagan life aimed at strength, order, prosperity, and divine favor through correct ritual. Christianity proclaimed loyalty to one God alone, even at the cost of suffering. Roman religion sought practical benefit. Christianity often embraced loss. Roman worship was compatible with empire. Christianity increasingly exposed the spiritual claims of empire as false. Roman religion valued antiquity and visible continuity. Christianity looked new, stubborn, and socially disruptive. To a Roman, this was madness. If your God is powerful, why are you suffering? If your religion is true, why are you being thrown to beasts, nailed to crosses, imprisoned, and executed? A Roman expected divine power to produce visible success. The Christian willingness to suffer appeared either foolish or subversive. And that is why the Roman world had so much trouble understanding the church. It did not know where to place Christians. They were not Jews in the Roman legal imagination. They were not just another local cult. They refused syncretism. They rejected the pantheon. They denied the religious grammar of Roman society. And because of that, Roman pagan life and Christianity were not simply different options in a pluralistic marketplace. They were, in the deepest sense, incompatible. Until Constantine, these two worlds stood against each other like oil and water. One was built on sacrifice, obligation, hierarchy, and civic religion tied to empire. The other was built on faith, exclusive worship of one God, allegiance to Christ above Caesar, and a willingness to lose everything rather than burn a little incense to the wrong altar. So when we study Roman pagan life and worship, we are not just studying a dead religion. We are studying the atmosphere into which Christianity was born. We are studying the household shrines before which many early converts once stood. We are studying the temples that dominated city skylines while apostles preached nearby. We are studying the festivals, processions, sacrifices, and imperial claims that formed the public world of the first Christians. And we are studying the mentality that made Christian refusal seem not noble, but dangerous and irrational. That is why this subject matters. Because the church did not grow in neutral space, it grew in a world where religion was duty, where the gods were tied to the state, where ritual maintained society, where military power sought divine blessing, and where emperor worship gave sacred shape to Roman rule. To understand that world is to understand more clearly why Christians were mistrusted, why persecutions happened, and why the Christian claim that Jesus is Lord sounded far more radical in the Roman world than it often sounds to modern ears. Before Christianity transformed the empire, it had to live inside this older sacred order. And before the cross became a Christian symbol of salvation, Roman religion had already taught the empire what power, duty, sacrifice, and divine favor were supposed to look like. The early church would challenge every one of those assumptions.